So, as photographers, one of our primary goals is to present a photo to our viewers and to direct their eyes where you want them to go first, which is typically the primary subject in your composition. When it comes to taking the photo, there are several techniques and rules that we follow to establish that foundation of directing the viewer's eye. But there are also several things we can do while editing our photos that'll help with that. After all, the human eye is generally most attracted to the brightest and sharpest areas of a photo. Fortunately, we've got plenty of powerful tools in Lightroom to help adjust both tone and sharpness. But in this video, I want to focus specifically on sharpness and how you can use Lightroom's sharpening tools to get crisp photos while avoiding over sharpening, which can lead to those distracting artifacts and noise, and nobody wants that. Now, one point I want to make is that before we begin, it's easy to confuse Lightroom's sharpening tools with its effects tools, namely the texture, clarity, and dehaze sliders. And while these sliders can absolutely add detail to your photos, they shouldn't be used as a substitute for sharpening. But let me know in the comments if you want me to create a separate video specifically on those three effect sliders. So with that, let's dive in. All right, so here you can see I've got this really handy test target that B&H Photo very generously provides on their website, which is awesome because it'll help me illustrate how sharpening works. Now, as you can see, this is Lightroom Desktop. And really quickly, everything I show you about sharpening, specifically the sharpening tool in Lightroom Desktop, works exactly the same whether you're using Lightroom Classic or even Lightroom Mobile, which is really cool. So as you can see, what I want to do is I'm going to zoom in really tight. Like this is 800% that I'm zooming in on this specific checkerboard pattern. And the reason why I want to do that is because this arrangement here will illustrate how sharpening works better than anything else over here. So again, let's get the checkerboard pattern over here. And you can see that with sharpening, there are 4 sliders here. And by default, if you are new to Lightroom or Lightroom Classic, if I remember correctly with both of them, I believe that this is collapsed by default when you first go to it. So I highly, highly recommend clicking on this little disclosure triangle over here, which will expand and give you 3 additional sliders. Now, the first question you should ask yourself is, all right, well, when should I apply sharpening to my photo? And there's pretty much consensus among photo educators and photographers that this sharpening should be applied at the very end, or at least very close to your editing workflow. So generally, I would have already gone through and made my tone and color edits, any localized edits using masking, even applying the effects like clarity, dehaze, and texture. And at the end there, I would go ahead and apply sharpening, because by that point, the image is at its pretty much its end state in terms of editing. Sharpening will just kind of really bring out those edge details in a really pleasing way, but as long as you do it correctly. So let me show you that right now. So you can see right off the bat that sharpening is composed of 4 sliders. There is the amount slider, which is called sharpening in Lightroom, but in Lightroom Classic, you might see it as amount. Then there's radius, detail, and masking. And the amount slider is pretty self-explanatory, or the sharpening slider. To understand what sharpening is, it's basically just contrast. That's all. It's not some secret magic thing. It's just adding contrast to detected edges. It'll make a dark edge darker, and it'll make a bright edge brighter. And by doing that, you're adding contrast, and it gives the impression of more toothiness, more detail. And that, again, is very visually pleasing. So watch. Look at the edges of the checkerboard, especially the black edges. Watch what happens when I start adding sharpening. Do you see what's happening here? I'll go back and forth really quickly. Do you see how that edge, like right over here, this edge, it's getting darker? And because the edge here is already white, it's not getting much brighter, but if it was a darker shade of gray, it would actually get brighter. So you can see if I bring it all the way to the maximum value here of 150, you can see that there's this extra dark edge along every single black checkbox, and it's even over here as well. So that is what sharpening is when you add it to your image. So essentially, when you're adding sharpening using the sharpening or the amount slider, Lightroom is basically adding contrast to the defined edges within your composition. After that, there is radius. Now, it's best to think of radius as kind of like a feather control. And really, what I would have loved to have seen is to have a unit over here called pixel, because radius is basically controlling how many pixels in should the sharpening be applied. So from any detected edge, how many pixels in should it go? Notice how the minimum value is not 0, but 0.5. So this is half a pixel, and it goes all the way up to 3 pixels. And so what I'm going to do is reset this to the default value and look at this edge over here. Right now, you can see the default value of 1 pixel, and you can see this is 1 pixel where the sharpening is being applied. Now watch what happens if I bring that over to a half pixel. You see how there is now a half a pixel where the sharpening is applied. And if I bring the radius all the way out to 3 pixels, you'll see that there is now a full 3 pixel amount added of the sharpening to each of these black squares. Now, you might ask, okay, well, what's the best value? Like, if I just want a standard value, what should I go with? And to be honest, for the most part, I do find that the default value of 1 or even 0.5, those are your best values. In all of my editing experience, I've never really had to go beyond that. For the most part, a pixel value of 1 or anywhere to half a pixel is totally satisfactory. And the reason for that is, especially, it may not be as apparent in this photo, but when you start increasing the radius, what you'll see in your photos is almost like a weird halo effect, because the dark edges of your image will get darker and the bright edges of your image will get brighter. So it'll look like this weird halo, and that's not good. You want to avoid that. So again, just stick with 1, or if you're really concerned, you can just bring it to 0.5 and you'll be fine. Next up is this detail slider. So the detail slider is a funny one because basically what detail does is it controls the size of the detail or the edge that sharpening is applied to. So if radius controls kind of the distance or the feather, detail controls whether sharpening should be applied to big edges or small, finely tuned edges. And it's weird because it's counterintuitive. So what I mean by that is you would think, okay, well, if I have this detail slider here, if I bring it to the right, then the larger edges would get sharpening applied because we're making this detail slider value larger. But it's the opposite. As you bring this detail slider to the left, what's happening is only the largest details are having sharpening applied to. And as I bring it out to the right, every little detail, so all of the fine-tuned details, will have sharpening applied. And you can see that here. As I bring the detail slider to the right, these little details here, these little kind of artifacts start to appear because sharpening is being applied to everything. So this is most critical when you're working on, say, a wildlife photo of, for example, a bird, or some sort of a large cat or a dog or anything with fur. As you start to increase the value of the detail slider, you're going to see sharpening applied to every little whisker and feather and every little edge. And that might not be the intent or the desired outcome that you're going for, because what you're starting to see is over sharpening. So if we look here, this is a perfect example of what over sharpening means. We've over sharpened this image to the point where we're getting these artifacts introduced into the photo, and this will degrade the image completely. So to be honest, most of the times the way I teach is you can just keep your detail and your radius slider as default if you just don't want to think about it, and really only focus on sharpening and then the fourth slider, which is masking. But again, if you're finding that even a radius of 1 is giving you this weird halo look, just bring this to 0.5. And with the detail slider, just look at the image. Make sure you're zoomed in. That's an important point. When you're applying sharpening, radius, and detail, I find that zooming in, you don't have to zoom in at 800%. Like even at 100% or 200% will give you a good indication as to whether you're over sharpening. But for the purposes of this video, I found that kind of really getting in tight will let me show you exactly what's going on very easily. And also remember that we are currently at a full maxed out value of 150% sharpening. Like we can bring the detail slider up a little bit and then just bring back the amount slider. And you can see how those artifacts are for the most part going away. Now, just to kind of explain why we're seeing artifacts, this is a JPEG image. It's not even a very high resolution JPEG image. And so when you're working with JPEG images, especially lower res files, they'll fall apart pretty quickly in terms of these artifacts. You'll start to see these artifacts introduced. If you're working with a raw file, you'll have a lot more flexibility. But again, for the purposes of this, it allows me to illustrate exactly what's going on. So let's bring this back to 150. And again, let's just for the sake of simplicity, we'll keep these as at default values here and we're good to go. The final, and I would say arguably most important slider, I would say it might even be more important than the sharpening itself, because what masking does is it controls where sharpening should be applied. Generally speaking, sharpening should not be applied to kind of really flat, large areas. So things like clouds or a flat surface that doesn't have texture, or calm water. You don't want sharpening applied to that, because that's where you start to introduce artifacts, because sharpening will try to apply itself to every little detail. So masking allows you to say, okay, Lightroom, don't apply sharpening to flat areas, really only apply it to detailed areas. And so if I take this masking slider and start dragging it to the right, what's going to happen is Lightroom is going to start removing sharpening from those fine areas, and it's only going to keep it at kind of the most defined edges. Now, fortunately, there's also an easier way to visualize how to apply masking as well as these other sliders here. And I'm going to show you that on an actual image, because it's a bit difficult with this kind of black and white image here, or at least this black and white section, to show you how that works. But the point is, you can see that as I increase masking, that sharpening is being removed from a lot of the flat areas, and it's only being applied to the kind of most defined edges. And if we toggle using this little eye icon here, the detail panel, you can see how here it's almost kind of soft. Even though we're really zoomed in, the edges do look soft, but then with sharpening applied, they look more defined. You won't probably be able to see it with due to compression here when we're zoomed out, but as we kind of toggle, I can see all of the edges really snap into place, but at this kind of zoomed out level, it's kind of difficult. So let's go ahead and let's actually work on an image here, which nothing special to this image, it's just kind of this straw broom, but it has a lot of edges, and so it can let me illustrate how sharpening works. Now, one of the first differences that you might notice, especially when you're working with a raw file, for example, is there is a default amount of sharpening applied. So whenever I work with my Sony raw files, I usually have a default value of 40. And that's mostly because when you first look at a photo and it doesn't have any sharpening applied to it, it could look soft because it doesn't have any of that sharpening. So I believe that the reason why Adobe adds a default value of 40 is because it kind of gives you a good baseline. Like the image should look sharp enough where you can start editing it and not have to worry. And then afterwards, when you get to the end of your editing, you can refine that. But that's also why, like I said, you'll have, and it might vary by camera manufacturer, but I know it's Sony's, the default value for their raw files is 40. So with that, let's go ahead here and I'm going to walk you through a process of sharpening the photo. And I'm going to show you these alternate views for how to sharpen. And again, generally speaking, sharpening comes at the end of my editing workflow. I really didn't do much here. I think I just clicked on auto and let it do its thing. Just to get an edit going, you can see that's the unedited original. This is the edited version. Really not much going on here. But let's say I'm done and I want to apply some sharpening. Again, these are the default values. So the first thing I'll do is I'll zoom in, but here it's going to zoom in at 800%, which I don't need. Usually I'll hover between 100 or 200%. I like 100% because it kind of gives me a one-to-one pixel view and I can get an idea of what the sharpening effect is doing to the image. So to start here, I'm going to bring this to 0. Now, for all 4 of these sharpening sliders, there's a modifier key you can use to better visualize what each of those sliders is doing. On the Mac, that's the Option key, and on Windows, that is the Alt key. So for all of 4 of these sliders, I'm also going to press on the Option key. Again, if you're on Windows, use Alt while dragging, and I'll show you what that does. All right, so here, basically what I want to do is make sure that this broom is sharp. And I already turned sharpening to 0, so no sharpening is applied. I mentioned that there is a modifier key that I'm going to use, and that's the Option or Alt key. So watch what happens. Well, here you see what happens without pressing the Option key. It's just adding sharpening. If I press and hold on the Option key while dragging, you see what happens to the image? It goes into this grayscale view, and that's because it's easier to see the effect of sharpening or adding sharpening in this grayscale view, because when you start to add too much of that sharpening, the haloing, that kind of where the dark edges get darker and the bright edges get brighter, it's easier to visualize in a grayscale view. So if I go all the way here to the right, I can see two things. First, I can see all of the edges around the broom are they're just too sharp. They've been over sharpened, but also I can see that a lot of noise has been introduced into the shadow areas, especially in the bokeh area of the photo. And that is a byproduct of adding sharpening. If I bring sharpening down, like look over here with the image. In fact, let me zoom in a little bit tighter and I'll put it over here. Watch what happens when I add sharpening. Do you see how more of that noise is being introduced? But if I bring it back, that noise goes away. It's not there. So there is a really delicate ballet when you add sharpening, and you need to be aware that as you add sharpening, it does come at the cost of some noise. You can mitigate that with noise reduction if it's really kind of visible, but for the most part, this is okay. Let's go ahead, let's zoom back out. And again, I'm going to zoom in here to 100%. Just so that we can see the broom here. So the first thing I do is I press and hold on the Option key while dragging on the amount slider. And basically I'm just looking at the sharpest part of the image here, and I stop until it kind of looks like it's got good detail, but it doesn't look over sharp. And so that's good there, and that's when I let go. Now radius, same thing. If I press and hold on the Option key while dragging here, you get this kind of weird grayscale, almost like a mask view. Remember, radius controls how deep in pixels the sharpening should be applied. So here, by default, it's applying sharpening at a 1 pixel radius to every edge. But if I bring it out to the right, you see how that radius goes to 3 pixels, which means sharpening is really being over applied. And then conversely, if I bring it to 0.5, the sharpening is really just barely being applied to the edges here. So that is a way to visualize radius. Now, you can see here, if I bring it out, everything gets kind of crispy. Let me zoom in maybe to 200%. And you can see how it just kind of, it gets like super crispy if I go back and forth. And so again, that's why I generally advise a default value of 1, or if you're really concerned, if it's a low resolution photo, maybe you can bring it to 0.5 to make it a bit more conservative, but I'm just going to stick with the default of 1. Now detail, again, detail controls to the left, lower values of the detail slider controls sharpening being applied to large details, whereas bringing the slider to the right, making a higher value, it'll apply to all the smaller details. So if we press and hold on the Option key while dragging here, you can see how as I drag it to the right, every little detail, look at kind of the middle part of this bamboo or this straw here. If I bring it to the left, you see how there's not really much sharpening being applied to that middle area. But as I bring it to the right, every little edge, every minute edge starts to have sharpening applied to it, which is why it's also really important to not overdo the detail slider. And you can just see, like even here, like look at how much noise there is. So I'm going to go ahead and back off on that. Really, for the most part, I find the default value of detail to be okay, but I think it's important for you to understand how it works, because there are times if you do want to introduce sharpening to some of the finer details, just bring it up a little bit, and that's totally fine. Just don't over sharpen it. Now, the last slider, like I said, is probably the most important because it controls where sharpening is being applied. If I zoom back out here, and that's an important point, whenever I'm applying masking, I always like to see the entire image. I'm never zoomed in, and I'll show you why in a second. Right now, sharpening is applied to the entire image, like it's being applied to the broom here, and it's even being applied to this sign back here in the bokeh area. You can argue that you don't really need that in the bokeh area. You really just want sharpening on all of these defined edges that are already in focus. So with masking, what I can do here is if I press and hold on the Option or Alt key while dragging, first, at 0%, you see how everything's white? That means that sharpening is being applied to the entire image. And as I start dragging, you start to see black appear. And anywhere that you start to see black, that is Lightroom removing sharpening. So it's only being applied to the white areas. And generally, what I like to do is bring this masking slider out until I get what I call kind of like a pencil sketch look. So I really only want the finest, most defined details to have sharpening applied. And that's for this particular image right over here. And again, everything that's black now has sharpening removed. And that's why this slider is so important. So you can see, we can toggle here. You probably can't even tell. And that's actually kind of a really important point. If you can tell the sharpening, if you can look at this and say, whoa, that's like really sharp, you've probably over sharpened your image, because sharpening is not meant to be a cure-all for, say, a lack of focus. You can try to use sharpening to kind of add a little bit of detail to a slightly out of focus area, but for the most part, there is no magic with sharpening a blurry photo. And if you have a photo that's already sharp, sharpening is not meant to make it super sharp. That generally doesn't look good. It doesn't respond well to viewers. You just want to present a properly sharp photo. So generally here, you can zoom in and that's where you can toggle. And you might not be able to see it, but I can see, like, especially over here, when I disable sharpening, it just looks a little softer. Even though it's in focus, it looks a little softer, but with the sharpening applied, everything snaps into place. And again, you shouldn't be able to tell that it was sharp, and everything just looks sharp, or everything that should be sharp looks sharp. And again, these sliders here for sharpening should not be confused with these sliders, the texture, clarity, and dehaze sliders. Notice how, at least in Lightroom, they're under the effects panel. These are not meant to be sharpening sliders. You'll use these more to add an effect to varying types of high contrast edges. And again, if you want to see a video about this, leave a comment and let me know. And so I hope now you kind of have a really great idea of what sharpening is and how you could effectively use it with your photos. It's really powerful, and it's also very easy to abuse if you crank everything up, like most sliders. Just, it's a matter of applying a tasteful amount. Now, I have 2 courses. I've talked about these for a while now. I'm very proud of them, and I think you'll love them. The first one is called Lightroom Everywhere. So if you want to learn absolutely everything there is to know about Lightroom, whether it's Lightroom Desktop, Lightroom Mobile, or Lightroom Web, be sure to check it out. I'll leave a link to it in the description below. It's got over 9 hours of easy-paced lessons. And I've also got a course specifically focused on editing landscape photos using Lightroom called Lightroom Landscapes. That's got over 7 hours of easy-paced lessons, and the link to that is also below. I hope you check them out. Now, there are also third-party apps that use AI to add sharpening, so if you want to learn more about that, check out this video. And of course, if you found this particular video helpful, a thumbs up is very appreciated, as well as clicking on the subscribe button and the bell icon to get notified of all future videos. Thanks a lot, everyone.